Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, join me each episode as we discuss all things guitar. Well, hey there, and welcome into yet another exciting episode of Shad's Guitar Show. I am so glad you're joining me for this one, and I think this one's going to be kind of cool for anybody who's familiar with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers' Beano album. It's a high watermark for a lot of blues guitarists, and especially in that era of the late 60s when this kind of really started the whole Les Paul into Marshall sound that today we think of more in a classic rock or hard rock context. But at the time, this was a sound no one had ever really heard, and it was absolutely amazing, and it was really the beginning of something really special. So we want to take a deep dive into just kind of the gear Clapton was using, the recording techniques in the studio that had really never been done before, and just kind of the legacy of this album and, what it means to players even to this day. All right, so today we're diving deep into one of the most mythical guitar tones in the history of recorded music. We're talking about a 20-year-old kid from Surrey, England, a 1960 Les Paul, a Marshall JTM45 amplifier, and a studio in West London where over a few days in the spring of 1966, something absolutely miraculous got captured on tape. I'm talking, of course, about John Mayall and the Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton, better known to every serious guitarist on the planet as the Beano album. Named famously because of the cover photo of the album where Eric is reading a copy of the British kids comic, The Beano, instead of looking at the camera, which, honestly, if you know any of the history of Eric Clapton, tells you everything you need to know about his attitude at the time. So we're going to break it all down, the gear, the room, the recording techniques, the engineer's choices, and try to understand how that sound got made. So this one's going to be good. All right, so let's start with the instrument, because you can't talk about the Beano album without talking about that Les Paul. Now, by 1966, the Gibson Les Paul Standard had been out of production for about 5 years. Gibson had discontinued it in 1960 and replaced it with the new SG body style. So the late 50s Les Paul Standards, the one with the thick mahogany body and carved maple top and legendary PAF humbucking pickups, well, those were already used guitars, second-hand pawn shop finds, if you can even imagine that. Clapton's guitar was a 1960 Gibson Les Paul Standard, one of the very last ones made before the switch to the SG shape. It had a little bit thinner neck profile that Gibson had moved to in 1960, but it retained everything that made those late 50s standards magic. The mahogany back, maple top, and crucially, the PAF humbuckers. PAF stands for, as you probably already know, Patent Applied For, which was just the sticker Gibson put on the bottom of those pickups before they actually got the patent number. Seth Lover had designed them at Gibson in 1955, and the hand-wound coils from that era have a particular character, slightly unmatched from pickup to pickup, warm but with a clear, complex top end that has never fully been replicated, even by Gibson themselves. And if you want to know a detailed story of the Gibson PAF humbucking pickup, I did an episode on it a while back that you can check out. I think it was one of the earliest episodes, but we deep dive into everything about a PAF pickup so you can fully understand what makes them so great. So make sure and go back and check that out if you haven't already heard it. Okay, so let's talk about the amp, and this is where things get interesting. Clapton was using a Marshall JTM45 combo, specifically the 212 open back version, often referred to as the Blues Breaker combo, a nickname that obviously came directly from this album. Marshall actually later reissued it under that name, which tells you something about the crucial impact of this album. The JTM45 was Marshall's first production amplifier, released around 1962. Jim Marshall and his team essentially reverse-engineered a Fender Bassman circuit, a 5F6A Bassman to be specific, and then modified it. They substituted British KT66 output tubes for the American 6L6s in the Fender. They used a radio spares branded transformer rather than the American spec output transformer. And those substitutions changed the character of the circuit in dramatic ways. Where the bassman was open and punchy, the JTM45 had a slightly compressed, harmonically rich quality, especially when pushed hard. The KT66 tubes break up in a particular way, a warm, creamy saturation that blends with the natural overdrive of the preamp section. And here's the critical detail. Clapton was running the amp loud, cranked, wide open. This was not normal studio practice in 1966. Most engineers would have the guitarist turn down, put a microphone 3 feet from the cabinet, and blend it into the mix at a polite level. Clapton apparently refused. He wanted the amp cooking right on the edge of the natural power amp breakup, and he wanted that to be the sound of the record. And there are also persistent accounts, though not definitively confirmed, that he may have used a treble booster in front of the amp, specifically something similar to a Dallas Rangemaster treble booster, which was a common piece of kit on the London blues scene at the time. The Rangemaster is a germanium transistor booster, wired to cut bass frequencies and boost the upper mid-range and treble. Running one into an already cranked JTM45 pushes the input stage harder and adds a particular nasal cutting quality to the mid-range. Listen to tracks like All Your Love or Steppin' Out. There's a razor-sharp, almost violin-like quality to Clapton's lead tone that sits in the upper mids and just cuts through everything. That's very consistent with a treble booster feeding the front end of a hot amp. Whether it was a Rangemaster specifically or something similar is still debated by tone chasers the world over. Alright, so we've got the guitar, we've got the amp. Now let's talk about how this was actually captured. Well, the session took place at Decca Studios in West Hampstead, London, specifically at their facility at Broadhurst Gardens. Decca was a major British label at the time, and their studio was well equipped for the era, though it was fundamentally a pop recording environment. The producer was Mike Vernon, a blues enthusiast who was genuinely passionate about the music and understood what Mayall was going for. Vernon's role was largely sympathetic. He was there to capture the band, not reinvent them. The engineering was handled by Gus Drudgeon, who was later to go on to enormous fame, producing Elton John's classic run of albums in the early 1970s. But at this point, he was a young staff engineer at Decca. Now, the recording approach was remarkably live and direct. The whole band, Mayall on keys and vocals, John McVie on bass, Huey Flint on drums, and Clapton on guitar, recorded essentially live in the room together. Overdubs were minimal. This was a working band, capturing what they already sounded like on the bandstand, which is a huge part of why the album breathes and feels the way it does. The key decision, and this was the one that changed everything, was how they mic'd Clapton's amp. In the standard studio practice of the time, you'd keep the amp volume reasonable and close mic it, maybe mix in some room sound. What happened at the Beano sessions, by most accounts, was that Clapton had his amp turned up to performance volume, loud enough that it was actually uncomfortable in the room. And Gus Drudgeon had to figure out how to deal with that. The solution was to mic the amp close, let it be loud, and just commit to it. There's accounts of moving the microphone around the speaker cone to find the sweet spot, closer to the center for more attack and definition, out toward the edge of the cone for a warmer, more diffused sound. The most likely candidate for the microphone used was a Neumann U47 or similar large diaphragm condenser, though some accounts suggest dynamic mics were also used given the sheer SPL coming off the cabinet. The amp was also likely recorded with some room sound bleeding in because the studio wasn't fully baffled off. The natural reverb of the room gives the guitar a three-dimensional quality. It sounds physical, like it exists in a real space. Compare that to a lot of the heavily processed 80s guitar tones that feel like they're trapped inside the speaker, and you'll hear the difference immediately. There was also reportedly very little EQ applied during recording, What you're hearing is largely the actual sound of that Les Paul through that cranked JTM45 in the room. The console at Decca would have been a custom British desk, likely a valve bass unit, which would have imparted its own harmonic character to the signal. Valve control preamps of that era add a little warmth and three-dimensional quality that solid-state gear simply doesn't replicate the same way. The tape machine would have been an Ampex or Telefunken reel-to-reel running at 15 or 30 IPS on quarter-inch or half-inch tape. And here's another thing people don't think about: tape saturation. When you hit magnetic tape hard, it saturates in a way that's musically pleasing. It compresses, peaks gently, adds harmonic content, and glues the sound together. On those sessions, running that guitar signal hot into the tape machine would have added another layer of natural compression and warmth on top of everything else. And of course, we have to talk about Clapton's playing, because honestly, none of this gear, none of these recording techniques matter without that. So Clapton, at 20 years old, had been absorbing Chicago electric blues at a depth that was unusual for a British kid. He wasn't imitating Freddie King or Otis Rush or Buddy Guy specifically. He had internalized the language, the microtonal bends that land slightly flat of a note for emotional effect, the dynamics where a phrase breathes and swells, the way a rest functions as much as a note for space in phrasing. His vibrato on this album, that fast, narrow, finger-applied vibrato he used on sustaining notes, is partly a technique thing and partly an interaction with the guitar and amp. When you're playing through a cranked amp with a PAF pickups and the guitar is right on the edge of feedback, the amp is essentially responding to you in real time. Clapton learned how to work with that, positioning himself relative to the speaker to control feedback, using his picking dynamics to push the amp in and out of breakup. There's a moment in the guitar break on Have You Heard where he holds a bent note and just lets it sustain and bloom, and the amp is clearly singing around him. There's controlled feedback baked into some of the tone. That's a musician who has completely mastered his instrument and his equipment as a unified system. So what's the takeaway here? Why does this album still matter 60 years on to anyone who picks up an electric guitar? Because it proves something. It proved that the electric guitar, played through an amplifier driven into natural distortion, in a real acoustic space, recorded with commitment and minimal processing, that sound is one of the most expressive voices in all of recorded music. Every guitarist who ever chased a Les Paul into cranked Marshall is chasing this album. Every boutique amp builder trying to nail the PAF through JTM45 tone is working from this blueprint. The Beano album didn't just capture a great guitarist on a great day. It defined a sonic template that is still the gold standard for electric blues rock guitar tone to this day. If you haven't sat down with this record and a good pair of headphones, do it. Don't put it on in the background. Listen to it. Listen to where the guitar sits in the mix. Listen to how it breathes. Listen to that three-dimensional in-the-room quality that all the modelers and plugins in the world are still trying to crack. And though in this era of guitar playing, most of us are moving to modelers or profilers or, just easier gear to use to get our sound, there will absolutely never be a substitute for a cranked Marshall with a Les Paul plugged into it. And this album definitely proves that fact. And I would venture to say that as long as there are people who are interested in learning to play the guitar and in blues music, this album will be a high watermark for a very long time. If you enjoyed this episode on the importance of the Beano album to guitar tone, make sure to share it with a friend. And also, wherever you're listening, leave me a 5-star review if you would be so kind. It's very helpful to the show. Next time you're on YouTube, go to Shad's Guitar Show and make sure you're subscribed so you can check out content there. And when you're on Instagram, follow me at Shad's Guitar Show. There's a lot of cool things to check out there as well. And as I always say, if you'll continue to listen, I will continue to make content about all things guitar.
Bye.